curator of computing and assistant director and head of collections at the Science Museum. He's published widely and was awarded an MBE for services to the history of computing. He's a leading authority on Charles Babbage and masterminded the construction of the difference engine number 2, the first Babbage engine built to original designs. Thank you, Doron.
Very good, thank you very much. The context of this talk really is the announcement about 2 years ago that a bunch of lunatics, 2 of us, were going to undertake to build an analytical engine. So the context really is, well, you know, how feasible is this? What were Babbage's ambitions for the engine? How realistic it is to attempt to construct this thing? And what does the analytical engine signify in the history of computing at all? It's well known that the analytical engine supposedly embodies almost every logical feature of the modern digital computer. Well, is this a charitable gesture by a backwards projection from our own age, a charitable gesture to Babbage? Or is it something deeper than that? You know, is it saying something about the fact that if Babbage designed machines or conceived machines or was led to implement or realize a design in a particular way, and without any, in a sense, collaboration across the centuries, Turing and others came to much the same set of core ideas, does it say something about some fundamental suite of ideas that is at the core of what is possible in automatic computation? So there are a whole bunch of issues relating to the analytical engine. A huge amount of attention has been given to Babbage's difference engines, and that is quite understandable because quite a lot's been published on that. Very little, the analytical engine is very little studied, in fact, and although it is upon the analytical engine, the first general purpose automatic computational machine, it's on that machine that his reputation as the first computer pioneer rests. It is surprising, given the frequency with which this is asserted, how little the engine is actually studied. And there are good reasons for that, as we shall see. One of them is that you need to have physical access to the archive, and you're going to look at sources and so on. So, briefly, what I thought I would do is give some historical context, very briefly, you know, not spend too much time. Our focus is much more narrowly to do with the computational ideas in the machines than Babbage's life. So some historical context. Babbage's expectations. What was he trying to do? What did he think these machines would be capable of if he was able to realize them, or if anyone was capable of realizing? And in general terms, what did he think the potential of mechanical computation was, automatic computation was? We're going to look at some analytical engine designs and see actually to what extent he had a command, as we would now understand it, of what was logically at issue. And finally, the sources. We'll look at sources. What is the data, the information data on which we would base or hope to base a construction. And finally, challenges. Challenges, as far as I'm aware, is a word used by managers to describe things that are impossible. or alternatively, increasingly in the news, usually the way they describe a task that they've just botched. Why did the bridge collapse? Designing it was a big challenge. So with those slide comments, but historical context, let's not spend much time on oops. Already a problem.
Challenge.
Okay, what was supposed to be there was a collage of images, which I'm very sorry is not there. What they do is they're looking at the iconography of the 19th century. How was Babbage portrayed in his lifetime? The first was a miniature dating from 1813, which was a miniature in the family. It was a locket, and shows him looking very much like Napoleon. This was 1813, the day before the year before he got married and left Cambridge. Babbage was at Cambridge studying mathematics. He ran off without his father's permission and married Georgiana Whitmore. That was a very happy marriage, very tragic one in terms of the fact that Georgiana died in 1827. But his father was a wealthy banker and regarded it as imprudent for somebody to marry without means, without independent means. So we have Babbage here who's sort of defiant, independent, possibly even radical. The resemblance with Napoleon is not accidental, perhaps. He was subordinate in Napoleonic France, with whom England was still at war. The Napoleon Wars ended in 1815, and this was 1813. The next image, which you can't see, is 1845, this is a wonderful 1847, a wonderful daguerreotype by Claude, which is of interest to us because, especially as you can't see it, it's of interest to us because it's at around the time he designed the difference engine number 2, the one that is built in to be seen up in the gallery. There's an oil painting by Lawrence, which is in the National Portrait, which shows Babbage, 1847, so Babbage is in his mid-50s, enjoying the steam of his peers. This is a gentleman of science who's already been rehabilitated to some extent after his scathing attack on the Royal Society in 1830. 1832, he published a wonderful book called The Economy of Machinery and Manufactures, which largely, but only partially, rehabilitated him. He was never completely reconciled with the establishment, but he became an eminent man of science, a lion of the scientific establishment. And finally, we would see another image of that, is Babbage, which is what I call his Babbage book. The last known portrait, grumpy, dissatisfied, 1860. This was the last known portrait. He died in 1871. So that was just a. So we have, what we have is a transition from a radical, enthusiastic, vigorous student, possibly more defiant than was useful for his own good. Somebody proud, somebody very principled. Somebody capable of enormous charm and also wounding abrasiveness. He was capable of sarcastic public attacks, both personal and institutional. And Mavis Mosley, the author of the first biography of Babbage, titled it The Irascible Genius. And for all the scholarship since then, that was in 1963, for all the scholarship since, that is actually a profile that has endured. There's not a great deal that cannot be fitted into those two categories of extraordinary inventive ability and also a huge political ineptitude. Schmoozing wasn't his strong point. He believed that being right entitled him to be rude. He believed that protest was better than persuasion. So this was a vigorous, bold. He was a man of extremes. His friends could do no wrong, his enemies could do no right. And so on. So much for Babbage's life. What we want to look at now is actually the progression of how he spent his professional life. So we're turning now to the machines away from his life. That is the 1860 portrait, the one that got lost in the previous image. He's sort of looking less than pleased that we're poking around in his life here. So he was born in 1791 and he died in 1871. And from 1821, that's half a century, 50 years of his life, he spent directed towards the ambition of realizing mechanized calculation, mechanized computation, to design and build machines for this purpose. So for 50 years, that is a half century. That's roughly the breakdown. We're going to look at this in more detail. The epiphany came in 1821, over there, when Babbage was around 30. And it's a well-known, perhaps too well-known vignette of Babbage and Herschel sitting in the spring of 1821 in London, checking mathematical tables prepared by human beings. So they were done manually. Two sets done independently without collaboration. The idea being that you had a high degree of confidence the tables would be correct if two independently computed results were the same. And we have the well-known, very well-known thing of Babbage getting increasingly agitated at the discrepancies between these things as they were checking. He clasped his hand to his head, as it were, and he said, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." And steam is a metaphor both for the infallibility of machinery and also is a metaphor for mechanized production to solve the problem of supply. So we had astronomers who saw new celestial bodies. They wanted to plot their trajectories. And they would have to lobby government to lobby the Greenwich Observatory to get the tables. So the idea of the machine, part of the idea of the machine was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. The idea of a very strong metaphor was the metaphor of industrial production. The idea is that the machine would solve the problem of supply, apart, of course, from eliminating errors. Now, it wasn't in virtue of the machines being mechanical that Babbage believed they would be infallible. Everyone knows machines actually go wrong, they jam, they break. It was because he believed by making them digital and using integrity security mechanisms that had automatic error correction, automatic error detection, that he could make them inherently reliable. And we have proof of that in Georg and Edward Scheutz, the Scheutz engine, which was inspired by Babbage, a difference engine built for the general register officer using the 1864 English life table was temperamental. They had to evoke its music at the dead of night because it was temperamental. They had to be very careful with it. And that did not incorporate these security mechanisms. The Schultz engine is up in the gallery in the museum, as indeed are the physical relics of Babbage's efforts in his own lifetime to build the engine. So, 1821, he has this mechanical epiphany. And the idea is that the unerring certainty of mechanical agency, as Dionysius, the unerring certainty of mechanical agency would solve all problems at a stroke. That's the problem of calculation, the problem of transcription, the problem of verification, and all the four sources of human error in the production of tables. He became seriously obsessed immediately and had this realization to the extent that he became ill. He worked desperately hard from 1821 through to about 1833 on Difference Engine 1. By spring 1822, he had a working demonstration model of a difference engine. It's called a difference engine because of the mathematical principle on which it's based, which is the method of finite differences. And the idea was that this machine would tabulate mathematical functions. Each crank of the handle would produce each next value of the table. Now you had, in 1822, spring 1822, we have a man. The machine was driven by falling weight, so it was automatic. You could set it going, set it up and leave it there, and it would, and the fact of it being automatic actually cannot be overstated. The significance of that cannot be overstated. So you have a man whose predisposition and entire history was in mathematics. Between 1813 and 1821, he published 13 papers, all of them mathematical. So we have a mathematician now at the age of 30, contemplating an automatic calculating device and speculating for the first time on the potential of an automatic machine. So the question is, why are we talking about difference engines when this is actually about analytical engines? It would be the same as trying to understand EDVAC and EDSAC without looking at ENIAC. These were special purpose calculators, which were then generalized later. But in exactly the same way, the roots of Babbage's conceptions about the potential of mechanized calculation, mechanized computation, were rooted in these earlier speculations. And these writings, he wrote 6 papers between June 1822 and December 1820. He wrote 5 papers, all of them to do with the earlier speculations that arose from having the first automatic calculator that anyone had ever witnessed actually do something. And these writings have been largely ignored. They're barely studied, and the significance of them is not actually part of the mainstream canon of Babbage study. So what we're going to do is actually look at those papers. Here's a man contemplating for the first time what is the potential of automatic computation, for the first time in history, being able to speculate in this way. He then designed Difference Engine 1, and then there were 2 periods we worked on the Analytical Engine. He broke off in 1847, and with the benefit of all the vastly more demanding, the demands of the design of the Analytical Engine, vastly more sophisticated as we shall see, he incorporated in a device of extraordinary economy and elegance, which is Difference Engine number 2, which is the one that he's built and is sitting up in the gallery. So that was designed just in 2 years. 1847, 1849, the most complete set of plans we have. Then he took about an 8-year break, during which he worked intermittently on mechanical notation. And finally, there's the final phase of the Analytical Engine, where he was mainly concerned with physical implementation. How, given the fact he'd given up on government funding this thing, if he was to construct one, it would be done at his own expense, and therefore he had to have a cheap way of a process of making hundreds, thousands of near identical parts. So you had to have a process, a production process, with inherent repeatability. And he explored and pioneered pressure die casting in the 1860s, using Britannia metal. So in fact, he who first used pressure die casting with the view to producing near identical pinwheels in their thousands. Britannia metal was pretty impractical, but easy to work, but very soft. So, okay. The reason for these things is just in case people already have visual images of these various machines. We call it Difference Engine 1. It's actually 1/7 of the whole machine. That's sitting down on the ground floor gallery. That is the Analytical Engine design. It's a plan, the 1840 plan, which we'll look at in more detail. That is Difference Engine number 2, designed 1847-49. That's the one up in the gallery, works. And that is the Analytical Engine demonstration piece under construction at the time of Babbage's death in 1871. This is part of his attempt to experiment with production processes and to look at some working models. Now we're going to look at some of those in more detail. So let's look at what his earlier speculations were. Well, Difference Engine 0, it's called, which is his first model, 1822, has never been found. In fact, from correspondence, there's an indication he took it to Turin with him in 1840 and 41, and it never came back. I've looked for it there, I didn't find it. But from its description, we can look at Difference Engine number 1, that one, because the features are almost identical, except it's written by a crank but not a 40 weight. So that's the 1/7 of the whole engine, and we can look at this instead. So we're going to look at this instead of the last first model. The point about it is you crank a handle and you get results which up to that point in time you could only get by thinking. You set up initial values on these figure wheels, you crank the handle, and what it does is add a number from that. That's the third difference, second difference, first difference, tabular value. It adds the second difference, the first difference to the second difference, first difference to the tabular value. And each crank of the handle, each cycle of the engine produces the next value in the table of the first. This can do quadratics. By jiggling these wheels, you can actually make it do third order equations. So that's a demonstration model. It's made from the parts originally made for the full engine. So it's operated by, you set up initial values, you operate by cranking a handle, and you get results that appear there. So those are the essential features of it. He did consider, it's a decimal machine, decimal digital machine. He did consider other number bases. He considered 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, 12, 16, 20, and 100. So it's not as though he had some sentimental or unthinking attachment to decimal. It's probably the most celebrated icon in the prehistory of computing for all sorts of reasons. It has cultural significance, it has technical significance, but we're going to focus narrowly now on its computational significance as seen by Babbage when he first operated. First thing is computation as systematic method. Firstly, computation as systematic method, completely new idea. Up to that point in time, if you had an equation and you want to solve it, you equate it to 0 and then fiddle. Or remanipulate the expression into a form for which there's a known solution, a recognizable form for which there's no solution. Now that's actually quite unsystematic. But curiously, the mathematical culture of the time, prized generality and analytics above instantiation and calculation and contingency. So, if you like, in the philosophy of if you had this thing, you had to use a lot of ingenuity. There was no systematic method of knowing not only what the solution was, but whether in principle there was a solution. Was the thing solved? The issue of decidability, as it became formulated much later. So you've got an equation, you have mathematicians who have, if you like, monopolized the culture by which these things were solved, and what do? So if we look here, we set up a function, second order equation, and each time you crank the handle, you get the next value in the table. You found a root when the value of the function is reduced to 0. So all you need to do is to detect the all-zero state, and you crank the machine, and you keep cranking it until you get the all-zero state, which is then detected automatically, and the machine halts. When you found a root, the machine halts. Babbage talks explicitly about the machine halting and finding a root. Isn't this very reminiscent of something that happened much later, pre-going Turing and the criterion of halting? If there are multiple roots, you keep cranking, you get the second root. If there are no roots, you crank ad infinitum. So you already have Babbage explicitly talking about halting as a criterion of solvability, and by implication decidability. It will halt if there is a solution. So you have now computation as systematic method of solution, which is completely new. Now the question is, what was the attitude in his day of this revelation? And of course, the value of the variable, independent variable for which the root is true, is the number of times, the number of cycles in the engine. Now he doesn't dwell anywhere on the theoretical significance of this. If we try, before we get too excited about Babbage pre-going Turing, for him it's a practical issue. That's what would happen if you crank the engine. But the point is, he has now a method that is vastly more systematic, if you like, than what was prized by the analytic, by the people who favored analytic solutions. Trial and error was regarded as inelegant right? That was another method of solving equations. Another point of this was what Babbage saw essentially as a new technology of mathematics. Babbage saw these machines as new technology. That is to say, if you had an equation, or an expression for which, if you wanted to find the value of a series for which there was no expression for the general term, for the nth term, you could set the machine up, crank it, and arrive at a result which you could not otherwise result through an analytic solution. So here was computational method providing answers which analytics could not provide. Secondly, there was the question of heuristics. You could, what Babbage did was took various series and make a new series by taking elements of those series, much along the lines of Cantor's theorem 50 years later. You could create a series which was unlike any other series, for which there was no general formula, no general expression for the nth term, and still compute it. So you had a generative rule, but with no general expression. The way he did that, you can just see legacies of that. You can see external shafts here with external wheels, and he could feed back numbers from any decade in the result to any of the prior differences or feed forward. So while the thing was calculating, you could do internal feedback and feed forward and alter the result as it was generating. Now you know exactly what it's doing. You have a generative mechanical rule, but you have no mathematical expression for the nth term. So you saw machines having a heuristic value and suggesting new series, which were unlike any other series. He also predicted that there would be the need for numerical analysis. That is to say, and the example he used was, he had one expression which required 35 multiplications and 6 additions to evaluate. What he did was remanipulate the expression, and he found a way of doing it with 5 multiplications and 1 addition. This was a mathematically identical expression. So what he extrapolated was, he said that there would need to be a new science of mathematics. He didn't call it numerical analysis, but that's what we would call it now. That would be designed to optimize the preparation of problems for machine calculation. And he said that science would stultify through the overwhelming encumbrance of numerical detail without machine computation. So this is 1822. Now, I mentioned that there were cultural considerations. The silent premise of mathematics and philosophy of that time was that example was inferior to generalization, that induction was inferior to deduction, that empirical truths were inferior to analytical truths, and the synthetic was inferior to the a priori. So a machine that was number crunching, was very close to calculation, was no rival for the elitism, for the elitism of analytics. And Babbage was aware of this. He said that these ideas are not so much in unison with the taste which at present prevails in that science. And it's fair to say that that is a stigma, if stigma is not too strong a word, that possibly prevails to this day. And I would suggest, possibly, that an unexpected and unforeseen effect of Turing's 1936 paper, on computable numbers, actually gave a kind of logical respectability to computer science that it didn't otherwise have. Because this satisfied the highest credentials of mathematical logic in ways that the sort of engineering origins of computing wasn't actually able to satisfy. Finally, is the question of machine intelligence. The implications of this machine producing results, which at that point in time could only be arrived at by thinking, was not lost on Babbage's always contemporaries. Harry Wilmot Buxton, a junior colleague of Babbage's, wrote, "The marvelous pulp and fibre of the brain had been replaced by brass and iron. He, Babbage, had taught wheelwork to think, or at least to do the office of thought." Interesting distinction. And Lady Byron, who saw the machines, that very machine, in 1833, wrote, "Last week we saw the thinking machine, for such it seems." Now so savants of the day were already torn between enthusiasm for the potential of these machines and concern not to assert that these machines were capable of creativity, because to do so would run very close to offending religious views of the times. And Turing actually used what he calls Lady Lovelace's objection. Lady Lovelace wrote on the Analytical Engine and said, "The machine cannot originate anything of its own, it can only obey instructions." And Turing uses this, he calls this Lady Lovelace objection, to use as a counterpoint for arguing for more generous limits to what is achievable for machines. Right, so that's different than one, that's a significance. So we see that very early on, Babbage has not got to general, we've not got anywhere near general purpose computation. This is not even a general purpose 4-function calculator. It has a single algorithm. What's significant is the algorithm is embodied in the machine for the first time. This is a mathematical rule embodied in mechanism. And that's the first time that it ever happened. And it allowed Babbage to speculate in more general terms about the potential for machine computation, regardless of how that was accomplished. Now, if we close the loop on, that's difference engine 2, that's the one in the gallery. So that's the end of the line. Babbage, as we saw, designed this 1847, 1849, after he did the major design on the analytical engine. And that's a machine that is 8,000 parts, weighs 5 tons. It's 11 foot long, 7 foot high, made of brass, cast iron, and steel. It calculates and tabulates any 7th order polynomial to 31 decimal places. It prints the results in hard copy ink and presses the result on stereotype plates for the automatic production of printing press. So it does exactly what Babbage's original 1820, this is 1847, 1849. 1822, he said, calculate by steam the infallibility of machinery will solve the problem of errors in tables. That's an original plan of Babbage's, which is most evocative of its overall form, and those are the columns of figure wheels, digital. Each digit has its own figure wheel. So a multi-digit number, 30-digit number has 30 figure wheels, each representing one digit. So that's, if you like, the end of the line of difference engines. He designed one finally, finally got built, and his 1822 ambitions in some sense were realized with a small delay of 150 years. Okay, so we mentioned mechanical logic. So what I'm going to do is just read some features. This is still difference engine. We haven't got a general purpose computation yet. So these are some of the circuit and system functions that are explicitly embodied in the designs of these difference engines. Firstly, they're automatic. You don't require human intervention. They're digital. Through the discretization of motion, these machines are digital. Parallel operation, non-destructive addition. You can recover the add-end and addendum after the addition. Carriage of tens, microprogramming, pipelining, pulse shaping, that is cleaning up of ragged transitions. Error correction and error detection, binary latching, polling, input-output. These are features that are explicitly embodied in the designs, in the physical mechanisms of the design. So, if we step back from circuit and system functions, we'll look at some of those presently. What are these historically significant ideas so far that emerged from these very, very early speculations? This is before Babbage actually built anything or really did any substantial design. Firstly, the idea of the autonomous machine. Secondly, the idea of a mechanical process and of a machine cycle. These are all in both explicit and implicit in the machine. And mechanical process in the Turing-Newman sense. Mechanical process meaning an unthinking process. There's an unthinking, a mechanical meaning unthinking in the Turing-Newman sense. This is perfectly evidently there. He had reduced calculation to logical process and eliminated, if you like, the higher order functions of the mind, which are not indispensable to this. Plano, an Italian engineer and mathematician, made a very significant distinction. He spoke about the distinction. He said Babbage's engines made the distinction between the legislative component of mathematics and the executive component of mathematics. Legislative component was what mathematicians did. These machines did the executive component. They found the value of functions and found solutions. Babbage was very taken with this and lost no opportunity of repeating it. But what the machines are to do with the executive branch of mathematics. So mechanical process is part of that executive branch. The development of mechanical logic. He had to implement logical functions using mechanics. Digital logic through discretization of motion. The idea of machine intelligence, very fundamental. And computation systematic methods. So that's sort of how far we've got. We haven't yet touched general purpose computation, which we may never get to. Okay, we're now going to get to analytical engine design and look at the analytical engine. Okay, so the analytical engine represents a transition to programmable general purpose computing from algorithm specific special purpose calculator, which was a difference engine. And Morris Wilks, who in 1971, on the 200th anniversary of Babbage's birth, for an IEE event, wrote a paper which was really the first modern assessment evaluating Babbage as a computer pioneer. And Wilks, who was not who's not ever one to proffer gratuitous praise, actually described Babbage's efforts on the analytical engine as vision verging on genius. So this is Wilkes, who was one of the few people in the late 60s to actually look. Only 3 people ever actually have looked at the designs in any detail. Wilkes was one of them, and he looked at this thing and looked at it from the perspective of a pioneer of electronic computing, and came out with this, this very substantial endorsement of Babbage's vision in relation to the analytical engine. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at Babbage's work on the analytical engine expanded in that way. So we have 3 phases: early plans, middle plans, and final plans. Now the early plans, the 2 landmarks in the early plans. First, the anticipating carriage mechanism. I think we can, yes. Difference engine uses successive carry. That is to say, when you get, what it looks at is each decade in turn in a sequence, and if there was a carry warned in the previous edition, it will increment the next decade up. But that is essentially a serial successive process, which means that the length of time it takes depends on the number of digits in the thing. It's not data independent. It depends on how many digits there are. Also physically, there's a limit to how much you can pack in and how many devices. We'll look at that mechanism in detail here. So this is the carry mechanism for difference engine 2. So that's a figure wheel. Don't worry too much about it. This is the warning. That's a 1-bit latch, and that fairground. There's a plan view. That fairground is a helix of arms, which we'll see in plan. So what's going on here is that helix spins, and the arms of the helix poll each decade in turn to see if in the last edition there is a carry which needs to be taken account of. It also takes account of secondary carries, that is carries that result from carries. So if we look at that mechanism, you can see the helix, and that's the back of the engine. And there are 2 sets of these axes which rotate like bouncing DNA. And as they rotate, it polls, each arm polls each decade in turn. The point about that is that it takes time. The more digits there are, the longer it takes. And Babbage became obsessed with reducing the amount of time of the machine cycle because he needed the time for automatic division and multiplication, which took 120 units of time compared to this. So he was shaving off wherever he could and became quite obsessed by this. And in 1834, that's very, very early on, because he conceived of the first engine, 1833, the beginnings of the idea. 1834, which is terribly early, the first year in which he was working on this thing, he set himself the task of solving the problem of successive carry. And he wanted a way in which he could do all the additions, all the carriages in 1 unit of time. And he called this the anticipating carry. The idea being you could tell ahead of time where the carry would occur. It doesn't actually happen that way, but that's actually the way he saw it. And he set that as a challenge to himself. And it became his test of whether he was up to being able to design the machine. Whether he could solve this problem became equated with his capability of solving the problems of design at all. And one night he became hugely exhilarated, went off for dinner, and said that the rush he got from having solved the problem was better than the high he got from any bottle of champagne, he told his dining companions. And years later, he met a worker that he'd gone to discuss this with while he was traveling with it. This was decades later. He met this guy by accident. And he asked him, "Do you remember that night when I was trying to solve this problem?" And the worker said that he thought his master had gone mad, because he was trying to get machinery to make predictions, is the way the worker understood it. So this was a major staging post. It's a massively elegant and beautifully complex and beautifully elegant device, which allows him in a single unit of time to poll each of the decades and to execute both generated and propagated carries in 1 unit of time. And this gave him the confidence actually to go on. This 1834, terribly, terribly early. The second significant feature of the early plans was the introduction of punch cards for user-level programmability, and that was 1836, just before the end of the early plans. Won't say any more about the early plans because much of what was in the early plans is incorporated in his later plans, so we'll look at those. Those are punch cards, those are operation cards, we now call them instruction cards, those are variable cards, that tells you where in the store to put the particular quantity you're working on. We're now going to look at Plan 25, which is the best known of Babbage's plans. This was 1840, so that's the end of the middle plan. So it incorporates much of what went on before, and it is an iconic drawing. One is, okay, we're going to talk about the source later. When you read Babbage's stuff, what you're looking for, you're not asking, what is he saying? What you're asking is, what is this about? Because he makes absolutely no concessions to who's reading this. He makes no attempt to explain anything, provides no explanation. There is practically nothing written. His 7,000 sheets of scribbling books are largely, there is no meta information in them, there's no metadata. So a lot of the time you're not even asking, what is this saying? You're asking, what is this about? So the plans, single drawings which show the logical structure, the architecture of these machines are very rare. And what's particularly significant about Plan 25 is it reached a point where almost all areas of the machine had been dealt with, and he integrated this into a single plan. And this is the famous Plan 25, which is very widely published, and unfortunately isn't an exhibition here because it's gone to the British Museum for restoration. So we're going to look at this as a kind of iconic representative design and then discuss later developments. But this really embodies most of the first decade of development. So it's a plan in two senses. It's a plan because it shows the physical arrangement of the parts. It's a plan also because it shows logical architecture in ways that many the detailed mechanisms do not. And of course it's a plan because we're looking at it from above. So each of these circles, if you imagine, is a column of wheels going into the page. So firstly, that's the store, which goes on indefinitely. This is repetition. There are 17, they're called V. He used V to denote variables, but it doesn't mean it as an independent or dependent variable in the way that we use the term now. He uses variable because the contents of the store numerically changes. It's not fixed, that's the only significance it has. It's a mistake to think of it as a variable because a variable has, for us, connotations for algebra. And the issue of whether this machine can do algebra is one that is a significant question, historical question. So, they are variables, these are 40 deep, so those are 40-digit registers, we would now call them, going into the page, and there are 17 of them here. Babbage's minimum engine was 100 variables, and that would make the machine from there to the end 18 feet long. Babbage spoke of machines with 1,000 variables, right? That would make the machine 45 foot long. Just to give some idea of scale, the diameter of the central wheels is 5 feet, between 5 and 6 feet. These are 40 deep. So that's 5, 6, and they geared. That's actually a circular bus. Those are geared teeth, which is the internal bus for the processor. So you're talking about something utterly massive. It's 15 foot high, minimum of 18 foot long. 1,000 variables would be 45 feet long. So 5 foot across there. This is the central processor, the mill. What he called the mill, the whole thing. The way you get it, so firstly, separation of store and mill from Neumann architecture. Absolute, explicit, very clear. When he started looking at the mechanisms for doing various things, microprogramming, he realized that to build all these things and distribute them through the machine would be terribly, terribly expensive. So you centralize the expensive kit in one place, the stuff that does the processing, and you bring information to it, and he plots the development of his own thinking in this absolutely explicitly. At one point he says, part of this exercise is to examine my own thought processes, to document how I got to these results. And this is one that he's absolutely clear about. This isn't an accident, it isn't a happenstance. He actually did it deliberately for purposes of constructive economy. There is, perhaps the best thing I can do is to read you some logical features embodied in this, just look to see where they occur. And then we can return and discuss a few of them in more detail. Firstly, there's user-level programmability using punch cards. Microprogramming at machine level. So there's user-level programmability in the internal microprogram of the machine. Separation of store and mill. Serial operation of the fetch-execute cycle. So it fetches information, processes it, sends it back to store. And there are buffering. There's the ingress and egress, I and A. That is a buffer store, so if you want to get anything to the mill, you address the variable, you send it along that bus. There is a set of racks, which is the bus, which can link any element of store to any other element of store and ships things into and it sits in the ingress
axis over there, and then gets shipped around and it's processed. When it goes back, it goes to A and then back. So there's buffering using ingress and egress axes. Anticipating carriage we've spoken about. Internal repertoire automatic operations. So it can do direct multiplication, direct division automatically. Division is done by successive subtraction till you get a sign change. It's what he calls a tentative process. So you keep subtracting till you get a sign change. There's conditional branching, so you detect the sign change, restore the last subtraction, multiply by 10, keep subtracting. The number of subtractions is each element of the quotient. Each state that produces the next number in the quotient. Up to 50-digit registers with 100-digit results. So you can get double precision outputs, up to 50 digits, that's up to 100 digits. Parallel processing. There are multiple processors. These are the barrels, which we're going to look at in more detail. There are 3 of them. They can operate together. They can split the equation. So you've got multiple processing. Literally, you've got 3 separate processes working simultaneously, independently and together. You've got parallel data bus. That is a set of racks, which, as I say, link all the store to the thing, and the internal bus for the central processor for the mill is in these central wheels, which are all geared. And also, these registers weren't just single words. They were interleaved, so you had 2 words in one axis. Each alternate digit was actually a digit from a separate word, and you could access each of these by... so the way you circulated information in the mill between elements of the mill was using the central wheels. Punch card input of data and instructions. Outputs were printed, stereotype content. They also spoke about a graph plotter. It's a fixed point decimal machine, sign and magnitude representation of numbers. So we've got serial operation, we've got input output, we've got a fetch execute cycle, we've got separation of store and all, and that's pretty well Van Neumann architecture, 1845, the famous 1845 paper where Van Neumann describes the that's our input, I beg your pardon, 1945. Thank you. Where he describes the fundamental architecture of that has dominated computer design from that time. Okay, we're going to look more closely. I mentioned microprogramming. One of the significant things about Plan 25, which I say dates from 1840 to the earlier Plan 13, is, okay, this one has 2 mills. But the store is arranged in a circular fashion around the circumference, which is inherently limited. So you can see an immediate architectural development is to make it indefinite by extending it around the side in a linear way. And that was just an example of how the architecture developed from 1836 to 1840. Okay, that's a drawing by Alan Bromley. Alan Bromley we're going to talk about presently when we come to sources. That is a barrel. That is what executes the internal microprogram of the analytical engine. So you've got user level. So the punch cards say add, multiply, do all these things in a particular sequence. And the question is, what internally automatically executes this? So we have here a barrel, and these slots are called verticals. Each of these verticals has a series of studs. That's not a stud, that's the base of the stud. The stud is that dowel there. So that's just a blank stud that's not loaded. And there's a stud which is loaded. So each of these is a vertical, we now call it a word. And you have a series of rods. And you can see there's a dotted line at the back. So each cycle of the engine, this barrel moves from that position towards that. If there is a dowel position, it will activate one of the rods and perform the actions. If not, it will do nothing. So each cycle of the engine, the barrel moves forward and immediately moves back into what's called the reducing apparatus. The reducing apparatus advances the barrel to the next word to be executed. Now, how far it advances depends, firstly on the word it's just executed, and a series of these sectors, which are labeled 1, 1, 2, and 4. So, it moves forward, activates these various things, and moves back, and then gets advanced. It gets advanced by a residue of a word in here, and also the sectors. The sectors are activated by various things. Firstly, where the last word told you the next word was, and secondly, in various conditionals. So, for example, if this sector is activated, it's got 1 tooth on it, so it's got 1, it will increment the drum by 1 extra vertical. If that one is activated, it will increment by 2, it's got 2 things, so it will drive that 2, 4. So you can get any combination of 1 to 7. Depending on conditionals. So you've got 2 things happening. It says, go to the next place, subject to the following conditionals, and then either increment or not increment by anything from 1 to 7. There are multiple conditions, so it's got multiple branching. For example, this stud, if present, when that thing is activated, will lift an extra sector with 1 tooth on it, and will increment with 1 more. Now that stud is activated if something called running up happens, which means that if there is a sign change, so that is a conditional branch. If it is run up, and therefore there's a sign change, and that is therefore raised, this will advance the barrel 1 more. So that's an instance of an external conditional affecting what the next word to be executed would be. Over here, there's, if that slug is present, it will activate that rod. If that slug is not present, it will not activate the rod when the barrel moves forward the next time. So this can take account of pre-existing conditionals. So that condition can happen at any time, provided the barrel is moved. And the next time the barrel moves forward, it will take account of that condition. If that's not present, it doesn't activate that. If it is present, it does. And you can have these multiple branches depending on the various conditions in the machine. So that's, in a sense, one way in which it executes division. If you get running up, which is a sign change after the successive subtraction has produced the sign change, then you have a conditional result. So that's essentially how the internal microprogram works. A single barrel may have 80 verticals, so it's a huge thing, and this will be several, many feet high. If we look, so we've gone to sort of 1840. The final plans are ready to do with Plan 28. Now the project that we've launched to construct an analytical engine is called Plan 28, after the most advanced and sophisticated of Babbage's plans. This is Plan 25, Plan 28. Now the point about Plan 28 is it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the sense of any of these exist. What Plan 28 is a federation of updates from the prior plans. So if we take a drawing from Plan 16 and produce a little modification in the corner and call that Plan 28, so Plan 28 is like a federation of updates, some of which are quite significant, mainly refinements, but some of them very elegant. And so Plan 28 is a kind of fictional thing, which is the name given to the project to demonstrate that was the most advanced of his thinking. So if we look now at the final plans, there's something called a half-zero mechanism, which we don't need to get. It's fighting for time. Babbage said, the entire history of this invention has been a struggle against time. And he wasn't talking about his own mortality, he was talking about trying to reduce machine time for execution. And we'll look at ways in which he did this. The last stage is down here, which is when he started experimenting with implementation and looking at pressure die casting, how we make it, and so on. And I think that's the punch cards, that's the device up in the gallery. Barely researched. It's not even known whether this is assembled correctly. So much is Babbage studied. But this was under construction at the time of his death in 1871, so it's very, very late. It contains pressure die cast wheels, the Britannia wheels. You can see the racks there, which actually are toothed slats, which link the various columns in the store. That's how the columns of the store communicate with each other through those slats, those rack slats, and these are various cams to orchestrate the lifting and turning motions required for the internal logic. Okay, Babbage, as we know, didn't complete any of his engines, and he made no serious attempt to construct it apart from these experimental models. We still haven't got to automatic computing. What we have is automatic computation or calculation, if you like. Now, for that we have to go to Ada Lovelace. Now, it's curious that it's Lovelace, not Babbage, who actually made the transition from calculation to computing. It was Lovelace who saw that quantity could represent entity other than number. Babbage always saw his machines bound by number. For Babbage, this was a new technology for mathematics. He never actually envisioned the idea of a computer in which quantity, number, could represent a letter of the alphabet or a note of music. And Lovelace writes explicitly about this. Nowhere in Babbage's published writings, in his 11 volumes, does Babbage talk in this way about general purpose computation. It is Lovelace who did this. And for all the things that have been claimed of Lovelace, 3 out of 4 of which are entirely false, that she was a mathematical genius, that she was the first programmer, and that she had an inspirational effect on Babbage's design of the analytical engine. They are completely unsubstantiated, totally unsubstantiated. To say that she had an inspirational effect on Babbage's analytical engine, to give some example, Babbage had completed, he'd already been to Turin. He started this in 1833. The major design plan 25 is 1840. He went to Turin 1840, 1841. Lovelace started studying methods of differences for his difference engine in 1841. So the major work on Babbage's analytical engine had already been completed before Lovelace actually came along. What she does deserve credit for which she's not given, is she was the one who actually saw where the power of computation came from, and that is symbolic manipulation according to rules. That you can manipulate symbols according to rules, logical rules, and that the content, representational content of the symbols was more or less irrelevant. Number could represent anything. And once you could capture elements of the world into number, and you could then get the machine, according to logical rules, to manipulate representations of the world, you could say massively powerful things about the world, depending on the two grammars. If you've got the grammar right of the logical rules, you could say very powerful things about the world. And it was Lovelace who sort of said, this is not a backwards projection, and it's not a casual kind of charitable gesture towards. This is Lovelace banging the table and saying, it is this that is significant about this machine. This is a machine unlike in kind from any prior machine. And so it is to Lovelace that we make the transition from calculation to computing. Ada Lovelace met Babbage in 1833 when she was 17. Babbage was 42 at that time. And Babbage still... Okay, so the conclusion you come to from reading Lovelace's paper, the single paper 1841 that she wrote, and all Babbage's published writing, that was Lovelace who made this transition. But there are other additional reasons for supporting this conclusion. Merrifield in 1878 wrote a report on the analytical engine for the Royal Society, and he said it deals with number, not with analytical form, which I think is very significant. And I have the smoking gun quote, because in 1869, that's 2 years before Babbage died, Babbage sat down and was going to write a general description of the analytical engine, and just recently discovered this in the archive. And that's Lovelace in a very stylized representation by Shannon, A. Shannon. Okay, this is Babbage sitting down in 1869, 2 years before he dies. He's now going to explain to the world his analytical engine. And he says, general description of the analytical engine. The object of this engine is to execute by machinery. And he lists three things. The first is all the operations of arithmetic. Second thing is all the operations of analysis. And the third thing is to be able to print the calculated results. And the only general term there is analysis. And it's perfectly clear from what follows. The thing stops after 2 pages. He never did anything further on it. But it's perfectly clear from what follows that analysis is not algebra. That is not the most general form of analysis of algebra. And the machine, although he was very exercised by how you get a machine to print a number above the numerator above the line and the denominator below the line, how do you tell the printer to do this? It was to do with numerical results, it was not to do with algebraic results. Now, it's either because Lovelace was not handicapped by any detailed knowledge of the mechanics, if we want to be uncharitable. If you want to be charitable, we could say she could actually see beyond the mechanics as to what was at stake here. But Babbage never did. There's no indication that Babbage saw anything beyond mathematics in this machine. Okay, so we're now going to look at sources. What is the information data from which we would know anything about Babbage's machines at all? And what would the data be for a prospective construction of a machine? Now, the primary sources are Babbage's technical archive held by the Science Museum, since donated in the late in the 1890s by Henry Previs Babbage, to whom Babbage, his son, to whom Babbage bequeathed them. And they've been in the museum's possession ever since. Now, the archive consists of about 7,000 independent items, about 6,947 independent items, of which 2,500 are notations. We're going to talk about notations. There are only about 400 drawings. These are large AO-sized parchmenty drawings. And there are about 5,000 sheets of notebooks in his 20 volumes, 5,000 sheets of scribbling books. And that is the source. As I say, he makes no concessions to posterity in trying to understand what he was doing. These are his private jottings, his private scribblings. I mean, that one is one where he is trying to make a concession, and it's intelligible and legible. A lot of the stuff you don't even know what, as I say, you don't even know what it's about. Now, I mentioned the notations. Now, notations are absolutely an indispensable and crucial part of the specification of the engine. Babbage's mechanical notation was a language he devised. It's a language of his own devising, of signs and symbols, which completely describe a mechanism. So, if we can look at examples, there are three forms of the notation. Firstly, there's a tabular form. So, he uses various alphabets. A sloping letter indicates that it's a moving part. A vertical letter indicates it's a piece of framing. There's a piece of framing. Then there are a series of superscripts, up to six superscripts and subscripts around these various letters, which indicate the nature of motion, circular, linear, whether it's continuous, whether it's intermittent, what parts it is connected to, whether it's driver or driven. All these are encoded in the superscripts around these symbols. So that typically is a table that would accompany a drawing. It would tell you what parts are connected to what, and what is the relationship, the operational and physical relationship between the parts. How are they fixed together? Are they geared? Are they pinned? Are they slotted? Then there is the timing. There's a timing diagram. There's a timing form, and that's the timing diagram for Difference Engine 2, the one that's sitting up in the gallery. And each of these symbols means something. For those into these kinds of things, I mentioned pipelining. There are four quadrants here. This quadrant is completely symmetrical with that quadrant. That quadrant is completely symmetrical with that one. And that actually is the pipelining. But this is time progressing. Babbage divided the timing cycle into 50 parts, not 360 degrees. And so each of these is a unit of time. And so what's happening is time works across this way. So everything on one line is happening simultaneously. Now if we look at one of these more closely, we can see perhaps, okay, so a double arrow indicates that the moving part is returning to its rest position. That's moved from an excursion and it's going back to its rest position. A little plus sign at the top says it's an additive direction. A circular sign says it's a circular motion, a little half moon there. Double arrow says returning to its rest position. The size of those things is actually the amount of movement. So that's 0.34 of an inch. So that sector, which is the sector wheel, is moving upward 3/4 of an inch at the first unit of time. F means free. L means the backwards F means it's free. L means it's locked. Locked means that there's a security mechanism preventing it from moving. Free means it's free to move. It's free to actually receive data from an adjacent wheel. A dotted line means that part of this movement will be executed by the wheel. How far a wheel moves is data dependent. If it's sitting on 3 and has to go to 0, it's only going to move 3. If it's sitting at 9 and has to go to 0, it's going to move 9. So the dotted line indicates that that wheel will move, and how much it moves depends on the data content. That loop there indicates, there's a little arrow there which is 1 unit of time, says that this device, which is the carry lever, will execute a movement only 1 unit in time, but somewhere in that envelope. Right? That's unlike something that says that's going to move continuously. And so on and so on. So this is an elaborate system of signs and symbols which describes completely. So that's the time. So we have the tabular version, describes the relation to the timing, describes the phasing and orchestration of the parts in relation to each other. And finally we have the flow diagram, which is what's called the trains. And he said that it's impossible. The machine is too complex to hold the whole of it in your mind. And you cannot trace the trains, the causal trains through this machine and not become confused. So he developed this system for trains. Now you can see a complete separation of data and instruction from the calculator. So it's data going in and drive coming here. And actually we can zero in on that. So that's looking. So this is an elaborate and exact and massively baroque system. He regarded as his finest invention. He saw it as a universal language that described anything. That's the movement of armies on battlefields, the circulation of blood in birds. This was universal mechanical language, but it applied here to machines. And what's interesting here, he says, after this sequence of events is completed, this stops the engine. So about halting, proteins of halting, this stops the engine. What actually that is the end of a stereotype page, so that the results don't overrun. It automatically halts the machine at that particular point. Now, it's curious that isn't it curious that here is a man faced with the most complex machine of his time, and he develops what we could call a hardware description language. And the next time hardware descriptions came to the fore was in the late 60s, early 70s with solid-state physics, where he was crawling around on the floor with a chart the size of this room, and it became too complex. You had to go one level up. And the next time hardware description languages came was in chip design. And we have two things separated by, I don't know, 150 years, where you're faced with complexity that is beyond the capability of human imagination to master or to marshal. And in both instances, one generated a language that allowed you to manipulate this and manage complexity. So see hardware description languages as a method of complexity management. So those are the three forms of the mechanical notation. Okay, secondary source, those are the primary sources. The primary source of the archive. The secondary source, the only three people who've studied. That's an example of a drawing there. You've got the tabular version, and that's a plan view of the printing stereotype apparatus in the difference engine to give an example of how the physical drawing and the abstract notation form an integrated description. That's the device, consists of 4,000 parts, and that's the device that was in that flow diagram, in the trains diagram. And that's the drawing of it, and there's the physical implementation. It's about 4,000 parts. That's a stereotype apparatus. Okay, if we look at now at secondary sources, there are three people who've studied this machine, all starting in the late 1960s. There's Bruce Collier, who produced the most absolutely exquisite thesis in Harvard 1970, which plots the development of Babbage's ideas in design. So he's not looking at the mechanics of the devices, he's not looking at the logic, he's looking at the evolution of the ideas. It's an absolutely beautiful thesis. I cannot believe somebody who produced a thesis of that quality went into university administration afterwards. Because everyone just wants to go and talk to him. Alan Bromley, whose masterful work decoding the actual first person, began starting in the late 60s, started decoding the drawings, and it's actually really he's responsible for what major understanding we have of the physical mechanisms. So it's less to do with historical development than it is to do with how do these things work. And then finally there's Maurice Wilkes, who wrote intermittently about Babbage, largely in the kind of, regarding himself as a guardian of protocols and practices at Cambridge. But his major piece of work he did was the evaluation of Babbage as a computer pioneer done in 1971 in an IEE paper. He was the first modern electronic computer pioneer to look at Babbage from a modern perspective and produce this evaluation. That's a paper published for a centenary 1971 centenary of the IEE, as it was then. Now, he also started now the point about it is that none of these three are with us any longer. Bromley published very, very little. He published 3 papers, 1982, 1987, and 2000. The 2000 paper, he knew that he was already not long for this world. He died in 2002. Maurice Wilkes has been died recently, and Collier died about 6-7 years ago. Now, Bromley's first paper, 1982, by his own admission, looked at 10% of the archive. The second paper is largely an expanded repetition of what happened first, with not a great deal more of archival work. It's the 2000 paper that really hurts, because it's from that you realize what a massive amount of knowledge is lost because it was not published. Now we're in touch with his widow to try and get his papers, but we actually don't know what's in them. And so Bromley produced these survey papers where he doesn't produce bibliographic substantiation for assertions, all of which the one is absolutely no doubt they're hugely well informed and absolutely accurate, but you can't really trace it. There's a huge amount of knowledge. The last paper was on Plan 28A, and it's evident from that his knowledge was absolutely massive, and that we've lost it. We've lost it. So a lot of what we're doing in the reconstruction is actually to relearn what has already been known. So part of our project to build this engine is to build in from the start succession planning. We don't budge till there are a bunch of postdocs there that are going to take this forward. We can't possibly do this all over again for a third time. So how realistic is it to construct this engine? The difference engine 2 was 8,000 parts. It took 17 years. It went from 1985 to 2002. And we started with a complete set of drawings. We reckon the analytical engine has between 50 and 80,000 parts and at least 10 times as complex. So if these things are scalable, we're talking about 170 years. So the question is there anything that can assist us in this? So what are the things that darken our prospects? One is the knowledge gap. The second thing is incomplete specification. We saw there at least three incomplete specification. We saw that there were 3 generations of plans. We've seen plan 13, plan 16, plan 25, plan 28. Which one are we going to build? Were all of them carried forward to the same extent? So plan 25, the one we saw, 1840, he's worked out the control mechanism pretty thoroughly. He then makes modifications for plan 28, which are improvements. Did he carry through the control mechanisms? I suspect not, and for the indications are I didn't. So the question is, what are we going to build? We're going to build something that wasn't his latest thinking, but is more complete, or we're going to actually now produce some creative analysis that says, well, here's a thing that is logically representative of what he would have done. So there's a huge amount of interpretation. We reckon there's probably 3 years worth of work before we can get to the starting point of where we were with difference engine number 2. There's no indication of how you drive this thing, as indeed for difference engine 1 there isn't. Okay, but there are things that do brighten our prospects. One is computer simulation. One of the values of, actually, there's one thing I needed to mention about Ada Lovelace and the anticipated carriage mechanism. This is going back, and what reminds me is because James Essing is sitting here. I mentioned that Babbage became completely obsessed in 1834 about the anticipated carriage mechanism, and he used this as a self-imposed test on whether he was up to doing the big design. And the one where his workmen thought he was nuts because he was so immersed in this. And through James Essinger's efforts, it turns out that his daughter Georgiana died in 1834, to whom he was hugely attached. He doted on her. And it's only lately that actually that date has been confirmed through James Essinger's efforts. And the speculation is that actually his obsession with this machinery was actually a product of distraction from grief. So that was an aside. Computer simulation. Construction and restoration brings you to a level of intimate detail with these machines that nothing else does. In principle it could, but it never does. And that's an insight that I'm indebted to Chris Burton for in a Manchester paper he gave probably before he can remember, way back. He said, what did we learn we could not otherwise learn? And I was shocked when he said nothing. But he said, you never do until you build it. So, I reckon that through simulation, we can get at 99%. That will bring you into a level of intimate detail with the logic of this machine in a way that will resolve almost all historical and to a large extent physical issues of feasibility through simulation. It will also have pedagogic value. I mean, the fact that you can zoom in around and people can experiment with this machine. We had to build difference engine 2 to fully understand it, actually. So in the same way that will be a heuristic process, because there are things they can't resolve till you try and implement them. And I'm pretty confident that you can resolve nearly all the logical and feasibility issues through simulation. One of the exciting prospects is, and we've got a research project underway, we applied for academic funding to pursue this, is whether the notation can be used as a hardware description language to drive the simulation. Instead of just doing a conventional simulation using mechanics and building the physics into the software, and nobody to this day has been able to tell me whether there's a program, software sufficiently sophisticated to actually drive a machine where you activate one element and the train through the built-in physics will drive a machine 50 or 80,000 parts. With 80,000 parts. People say if that does exist, it will exist in the aeronautics industry, but our initial probings have not revealed anything. So it would be absolutely spectacular if the hardware description language could actually could animate the simulation. As far as manufacture goes, if we choose the front end of the simulation judiciously, and so that it acts as a front end to a computer-aided manufacturing system, then manufacturing actually does not become the huge burden it was for difference engine 2. You just basically machine it out of solid, and you don't need the huge amount of drafting effort, with pen and paper effort that we did. The 20 original Babbage drawings grew to 160 drawings to specify each of the 80,000 parts completely. Well, that's just a mammoth task if you talk about 50 to 100,000 parts. So, finally, there's one thing that another assist, if you like, and that is there are pieces of the Analytical Engine that have already been built. Firstly, there's a 4-function calculator up in the gallery built by Henry Prevost Babbage in about 1910, based on the analytical engine design. It's a sort of minor work, but significant. The output apparatus for Difference Engine 2, which is the stereotyping and printing apparatus, was designed for the Analytical Engine and the Difference Engine. If you remember, Difference Engine 2 was designed after the major work on Analytical Engine. This is a dual-purpose printer, so we've already built 4,000 parts, and it works. It was very tough to do, much more difficult than building a calculator. There's practically no repetition in there. There's very few repeat parts. And finally, Tim Robinson has actually built more the Analytical Engine than anybody, including Henry Previs Babbage, out of Meccano. That's his punch card reader. He's working on the drum. He's building the anticipating carriage mechanism, and he's now poking around in the stall. So those are things that encourage us. So if we put all this into a predicted mix and look at the normal tried and tested issues of guesswork, fudge factors, divination, astrological portents, we estimate from our current state of knowledge about 15 to 20 years before we cut metal or to produce something, and about $20 to $40 million. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Doron. That's something absolutely fascinating for all of us at sort of different levels of understanding, so that's absolutely great. And questions or comments, please?
Thanks, Doron. I just didn't. I'm not a computer expert at all. I just didn't understand that point. Not long before the end, where you said that machining out of solid components. I didn't quite understand what you said there. Clarify that, please.
One of the advantages of computer-aided manufacture is you machine from solid billets. So you don't have to sort of bend and shape and then assemble. You can actually machine the thing from a solid billet. It's expensive in terms of materials, but because these things have XYZ control, the shape becomes almost irrelevant, rather than having to fashion things.
Won't that speed the development? Does it really need to be 20 years before you're building it, really?
Right, you're pressing me into uncomfortable territory here.
Sorry about that.
And so let me tell you something about Difference Engine 2. The actual time it took to construct Difference Engine 2 was 4 years. From the time that we produced drawings, gave them to the drawers and manufacturers, the 8,000 parts, brought them here, assembled it, was 4 years. I don't know how to describe the other 13 years without profaning your ears. We're talking about fundraising, prevailing upon people to support you, bypassing obstacles, institutional viscosity, sclerosis, and the various things that are involved in getting anything done. But the actual physical work was 4 years. So you know, extrapolate, allowing a margin. We can probably do the initial analysis under 3 years. But one huge plus, which, thank you for reminding me, which I remember to mention, is the Science Museum has digitized the archive. I don't know if it's evident just how important it is. 3 people have studied this. To study it, you had to be in the library here. Now you have to go to Rawdon, 70 miles out. There are 7,000 sheets, 500 drawings. It's almost impossible to manage on a table more than 3 drawings. I mean, we had 165 drawings for Difference Engine 2. They are heavy. You can't pull out one from below the rest without tearing it. I mean, it's a really mundane, bizarre thing. Just managing the information. It is now digitized. I can sit and pull out any drawing, zoom in on it. You can see the notations. You can have multiple drawings in there. And now, I believe this will revolutionize Babbage studies. My belief is that the world is waiting to study Babbage, of course. And this will configure. It is extraordinary the difference that makes. Otherwise, you've got a round trip of 4 hours from London to Rawdon, and you've got a 2-hour working day. And you're talking about having to work on this for years. So one huge assist is, one is distributed processing. This, when it's the museum is planning to release this information, when this is released, there'll be a huge number of distributed folk around the world who we hope to harness their insights and work. And that is, you know, that should be right up front as one of the main things that will assist us.
You touched on one point towards the end there, that the reason Babbage had so much trouble with the later parts of his life, he kept changing his mind about the design. Do you really know what design you're aiming for if you do go for a rebuild, or are you going to have the same problems?
what it boils down to is the incompleteness of the specification. The starting point of Difference Engine 2 is a complete set of drawings. He never went back to it. They never suffered improvement. The problem with the Difference Engine, the Analytical Engine drawings, one is there's 3 separate phases. 2, it is perfectly clear he did not carry through each of the, when he upgraded one area, he didn't ensure that the whole thing was upgraded to the same level of detail. So the big concern is not the logic of conception, which we can probably decode, but the control mechanisms. Are there as many control mechanisms for plane 28A as there are for plane 25? And so in answer to the question, do we know what version we're in? Well, the answer is no. And there's, the initial stage is to evaluate the completeness of the drawings and then to make a sensible decision on what would be useful as a representative analytical engine. And it may involve elements of all three phases.
I'm sure this is a very idiot level question, but can you characterize the analytical engine in terms of its basic computing parameters? You know, how big was the store, what was the cycle time, etc.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have. Right. Yes, that's a deficiency in that. To ask at the end of a lecture on analytical, what does the analytical engine do, is rather sobering. Okay, well, what it can do is it can execute any series of instructions in an order determined by the user based on the sequence of operations. It is also capable of iteration, that it can repeat the same sequence of operations a predetermined number of times using a combinatorial card. There are various cards. There's variable card, operations card, combinatorial card, number card. So they're data cards. They're cards that tell you where in the store it must go. There are operation cards with a series of instructions. There's combinatorial cards telling you how many times it needs to iterate. It can't do recursion. You can't call a subprogram from within a program, but it can repeat the fixed cycle. So it's a capable iteration but not recursion, which is a sort of subtle decision. As far as the length of the store goes, Babbage's entry-level machine was about 100 variables. So its store would have 100 words, 40 digits high, and it would be capable by configuring it automatically to do double precision arithmetic. In terms of cycle times, we're talking about a 50-digit multiplication taking between 2 and 3 minutes. So we're talking minutes. We're talking simple addition in tens of seconds. A Difference Engine 2 produces one 31-digit result every 6 seconds. So that does 8 additions in 6 seconds, 8 31-digit additions in 6 seconds. That's using successive carries. So the addition thing is very fast because he optimized it, but the multiplication division, that's what he was fighting. But 120, 130 units of time for multiplication and division because of this tentative thing on the division and multiplication. You prepare multiples of integers as a table before. It's quite misleading because a lot of the stuff is to do with tabulation. What he's doing is automatically tabulating multiples of integers and then doing multiplication by accumulation of partial products. So that all that is time consuming. It takes over 100 units of time.
Doron, I've always been intrigued by the apparent gap between, let's say, 1870 and the 1930s, 40s, when not much seemed to happen. And you suggested that Maurice Wilks was the first one to make a serious study of Babbage's. Yet I have heard that Howard Aiken, at the Mark I at Harvard, was familiar, I don't know to what extent, with Babbage's work, and I wonder whether you can comment on that.
Yes. Howard Aiken saw himself and portrayed himself as Babbage's heir. He said, everything I learned about computers I learned from Babbage. Well, an historian called Cohen went to extraordinary lengths to show that Aiken knew nothing about Babbage. In fact, he was just styling himself to position himself historically. He traced what sources Aiken might have had to a particular book and worked out when he had the book in relation to when the statement ran. So he did tried to do a demolition job on Aiken. And it's curious that Babbage sort of had most pioneers of computing had heard of Babbage, but almost invariably and completely credibly say, detailed knowledge of the analytical engine did not inform what I did. It's entirely credible. You would have had to study the drawings. If they had, it would have been published, it would have been known. There's no conceivable way it would not have been. So you had to be the physical archive. Aiken, so what most, all the great computer mind, and this has been surveyed, so we knew of Babbage, Zuse, Turing, all these guys, they knew of him, but the analytical engine designs are not the DNA of modern computing, because they did not inform designs. Aiken is the only one who said, yes, they were. And he's the only one history has made absolutely sure is discredited. So I.D. Cohen has written, he wrote first a paper in Annals, which is quite harsh. His book, written with the research student that he did the work with, is more charitable, but it comes to the same conclusion, that Aiken did not have any detailed knowledge of Babbage's. He's saying it was the way he was positioning himself for posterity, is I.D. Cohen's conclusion.
Yeah, mine is more of not just a question, but just more of a thought. When I first came across Babbage, it was when I found your book in a second-hand bookstore. My wife
was it reminded?
Oh yeah. So what struck me more than anything was not. I mean, I was eager to sort of find out if his ideas did come to fruition through your own efforts. You know, we know that he was not just barking up the wrong tree, and that applies value, you know, to what he did. But more than anything, it was just a real inspiring tale about a man with ideas that were plucked seemingly out of nowhere. And I feel that there's so much more value in that idea that even if I honestly, your pursuit here is brilliant. You're going to build the analytical engine, I'm sure of it, but the educational value in teaching children and children of all ages, that you can push the boundaries and you didn't mention them here, but Babbage had some wacky ideas, and I'm sure some of them found them into the design. So I just wonder what efforts are being made to exploit the educational values, and not just on understanding the engines, but understanding the value of ideas.
That's a very thought-provoking statement. Plan 28 is a charitable organisation. That's the project to build the analytical engine, and has values that any public sector body would be proud of. Its purpose is primarily educational. To build an engine both as a monument for the social value of doing all that stuff, but actually one of the attractions of simulation is to be able to produce a pedagogic tool that will allow them to understand these things. So at one level, what you're saying, I absolutely agree with, that the value of history, the value of museums, is actually, I think, one of the biggest, most powerful messages of an historic object is it defamiliarizes you with the present. It says, it wasn't always like this. And that is what, you walked up to Pilot Ace, the Pilot Ace, Turing's Pilot Ace, 1950, down in the Gallery 1, took a bunch of school kids to it and said, what do you think this is? And there's a telephone dial on it, and they plug it and said, there's a telephone exchange. So to tell them it's a computer actually, is a disjunction that will register with them. So the power of monumental objects as bridges across time, I think, is one of the really most powerful social messages of museums. In a narrower sense, the purpose of the Plan 28 is to build this engine for public display and for public education. At a higher level, to what extent, the more difficult question is, to what extent is this drawing attention to or signaling the value of ideas? I think that is, in a sense, implicit. I think that becomes implicit. I don't know how many times I've demonstrated Difference Engine 2, and it's still, after all these years, you put somebody for the first time behind the engine, people who haven't seen those double helixes turn.
I haven't seen it yet.
You haven't seen it. No. And you turn the handle, and you hear people, you hear of people, it's a kind of cliche, their jaws drop. I've actually seen this happen.
I'm waiting.
Physically, they go, it is, good golly. And I think the power of that spectacle, the power of that spectacle, and what that does is extraordinary. It was described by Francis Spufford. It says, what sense does it make to stand in front of a difference engine 2 or any of these engines where the technology has so far superseded what you're witnessing? And what he said was, and he captured it beautifully, he said, it allows you to experience the prospect of a future already past. And so you stand in front of the machine and you experience it as would a Victorian, because it is so removed from anything familiar. And I think that addresses perhaps the higher level question you're asking about, what are we doing? What does this say about the value of ideas?
Excuse me. My name is Tony Freeth. I do work on the anti-Kithra mechanism.
You do more than work on it, yes.
First, I'd like to say I thought this was a wonderful talk, and I think your achievement in making the difference engine 2 is already fantastic, and this is just a tremendous project. It's a project that's got to happen. It sounds a little bit to me like nuclear fusion at the moment, which is always 30 years ahead. It's a daunting prospect, but I think it's a project that must happen. I'd just like to say something specific about building models, because I've built models of the anti-Kithra mechanism. People presumably would be familiar with it. It's a 2,000-year-old ancient Greek astronomical calculating machine using software. And some other researchers have built models in hardware. And I think it's been a very notable feature of research that people who built models in hardware tend to get stuck on ideas, because there's such a huge investment in making a model. And the great thing about building models in software is the flexibility. And with all the uncertainties you have, it seems to me essential to build in software. And the second thing I want to say really is you've got to choose the right software. I chose the wrong software really, which is a film and TV animation software called Lightweight, which produces beautiful looking pictures, and sure enough you turn the handle and there's around 55 gears in it and they all turn correctly and so on. But even with just that small number of gears, putting all the mathematical formulae and so on, it's not the right software to use. So I don't know what the right software is for you, but I think it's essential because of the aspect of flexibility to build in software first, And anyway, I think it's a fantastic project. So thanks very much for the talk.
Thank you.
Can I just come back to your comment earlier that the analytical engine wouldn't do recursion? Did you actually mean recursion? Or did you just mean it wouldn't do subroutines? Because what you then went on to talk about was subroutines. Yet, I recall that Ada Lovelace is actually credited with inventing the idea of the subroutine. Could you comment, please?
If we put aside, and what may be clouding the issues is what we mean by recursion. So if we just put that aside, what the machine can do is execute a series of operations for operation cards, and then backtrack a fixed number of cards and repeat, and it can do that a fixed number of times. That's all it can do. So
it can't store a return address,
no.
Go somewhere and then come back. So it can't do subroutine call.
No. That's what I mentioned. You couldn't call the subroutine call in program. One of the reasons for this is, one of the reasons it can't do algebra actually, it's a complete misunderstanding. And as I say, either Lovelace was a visionary and thought that the machine ultimately could do algebra. But it's a misunderstanding. The idea that it's confused by what we mean by variable and what Babbage meant by variable. What the variable card does is tell you what position in the store to put a number. But there was no idea of sequential addressing. So this is like absolute addressing, and that's all you can do. You can send it there and you can call it. And there's no way of keeping track of where it is except by calling it again. And that produces huge limitations, and that was actually one of the big restrictions. It was Knuth who said, to understand what a program is, you have to look at the history before 1945, before von Neumann. And he said the idea of a program didn't exist because the idea of sequential numbering of memory location didn't exist. And the biggest transition from thinking there wasn't a program to program was this idea of sequential addressing. And that has always stuck with me. It's a backwards projection. It's an anachronism to talk about programming, for Lovelace or for Babbage, in fact, except to mean in a general way a stepwise sequence of operations.
Okay, you said no recursion. You did say there was iteration. Is there nested iteration?
No.
Right, you can't do that here. Okay, right.
Yes.
My second question is, when you built the second differential engine, I think I believe that you used the technology of the time in order to construct the various components. When you come to build the analytic engine, will you do the same thing, or will you use the most modern methods of production?
I need to correct. We didn't use period technology. I had fond wishes of us being in leather jackets and in a gallery with, in a gallery doing this stuff on lathes with non-standardized lead screws. But we would run into the same trouble with Babbage, and that is that he lost credibility after 11 years. And he built very little. So we didn't use period technology, but we made no parts. So we unashamedly used computer-aided manufacturing, computer-aided design techniques. But we made no part more precisely than we know from measurement Babbage himself could have achieved by other means.
That's what I mean.
Yes. So the tolerances are, at best, no better than Babbage's, and wherever we could make it more sloppily, we did.
And for the analytic engine, are you going to do the same?
I suspect that we will set a range of tolerances and let the machine do it, so that we know that. You see, what part of the difference engine 2 was to vindicate Babbage. It wasn't set out to vindicate. The question is, would he be vindicated if the thing worked? And so we had to resist the charge that would say, you built Babbage's engine, but Babbage couldn't have. So that actually was the drive. The issue of authenticity was not to do with authentic methods of manufacture, but issues of tolerancing. And of course, tolerancing didn't exist in Babbage's times. I mean, the standardization only started with Whitworth in the 1850s. Babbage designing before there. So the issue of tolerancing is a complete anachronism. You couldn't ask of Babbage's drawings what are the limits here of precision. He would have written on the drawing, make to fit. And the point is they could make things as precisely as you like by fettling them. So you fiddle around until they worked. So the issue of achievable precision, which is what's most commonly cited as the reason Babbage didn't succeed, does not stand up to anyone who knows about 19th century manufacturing. So in terms of manufacture, we would use modern machinery, but use the same issue of making no parts no more precisely than Babbage himself could have done by other means.
Can I ask one question about Ada? I prefer to call it Ada Doron the Lovelace. I'm sorry, I've got a sentimental attachment to the Christian name. I've just finished writing my book about Ada. It's being published on June the 6th, called A Female Genius. I had an epiphany myself. I mean, everything you say about Ada is accurate. I mean, I wrote the book partly to investigate it all and to try and demythologise her book. But the crucial extra concept that she saw things Babbage didn't, I think is actually true. One of the epiphanies I had myself was a famous letter, which you've probably all heard of, where Babbage uses the phrase enchantress of number. And I never knew what he meant by that. I was convinced it probably meant the analytical engine. But after doing this research and looking at this and thinking about it and talking about it with my female colleague, with female friends, I came to the conclusion that actually he probably did mean her. I just wonder, I know it's not really central to this amazing talk which has been so illuminating about the sheer technical aspect of Babbage's genius, but I just wonder whether you've yourself come to any other conclusion about what he meant by that phrase in that famous letter from 1843 where he mentions the phrase enchantress of number.
The way I resolved it was, say, it's difficult to know what Babbage did mean, whether it was analytical engine or Ada, but it would be nice if he meant Ada.
Well, thank you very much again, Doron, not only for the talk, but also for the quality of the discussion, and thank you too for your comments and contributions and questions to enable you to talk some more about it. So, as we've heard, just sort of reiterate the wonderful talk and illuminating and everything else. So we've had a lovely time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have got the IFIP Science Museum CCS conference on 17th and 18th of June, for which registrations are now taking place, and there are limited numbers, so please do register if you want to attend that. Then in September, for our new season, our first event is going to be at Hursley Park, the IBM Centre, on Friday the 27th of September. And details will be going up on the website about that. That is something that pre-registration will be required for because it's a secure centre, but it is a really interesting place to visit. There will be interesting talks, so do register and come to that, please. And just one more event that I can tell you about, and especially since we've heard from the speaker this afternoon, Tony Freeth will be talking on the 12th of December, which, because it's the Christmas period, will be the second Thursday that month, on the anti-Curator device. So make a note of that as well. And then we are going to have talks in October and November, and they will be going up on the website when they're finalised. So have a wonderful summer, and I hope to see you in September and December and October and November when we get those finalised. Thank you.